The personalities that matter with Keith Vaz on Talking Points.
Lyca Radio.
Welcome back. This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Lyca Radio. I hope you enjoyed the music. All of you listening to this program would have heard of the Titanic, not just because of Celine Dion's song or the famous film, but because it really happened. Well, I want to tell you a little about an Indian Titanic, a tragedy that cost the lives of hundreds of Indian people. This year, November the 23rd, marks 80 years since the attack on the SS Tilawa in 1942. My special guest is Emile Solanki, who was born in South London to Gujarati immigrant parents from Uganda and who relocated to Leicester in the late 1960s. Emile is 35 years of age and currently employed as an account executive in Canada at one of Canada's oldest and most famous insurance companies, specializing in wealth management strategies. He's been in the finance industry since 2003. He's the husband of Gabrielle and father to their son, Lyca. He's now working in his spare time on this incredible and intriguing project called Tilawa 1942, The Forgotten Tragedy. And that's the focus of our talk today. He joins me this morning from Toronto in Canada. Good morning, Emile.
Good morning, Keith, from snowy and ice-cold weather in Toronto.
Well, I am glad I'm sitting in my coat here because it sounds very cold. My sister-in-law lives in Toronto and she sent me some pictures of the snow. Now, tell us about this incredibly interesting project, the Tilawa 1942 Forgotten Tragedy. Why have you decided to remind us all about this particular tragedy?
So, because this story has many nuances and complexities, it's got that unique British perspective. It represents the Indian immigrant story in the middle of World War II, many from humble backgrounds trying to break away from poverty, looking to the continent of Africa for better prospects. You know, generally speaking, when we look back at modern history, there are several famous events that come to mind. You mentioned the Titanic, Lusitania, and Pearl Harbor, and there is much attention to events like these, but there are many more stories to be told. And I would describe that this event really is the Indian Titanic for us. You asked what the background was on Tilawa. It was a cargo passenger liner built by the British India Steam Navigation Company in 1924. It was actually named after a Burmese port, and it was in use for about 18 years. Its route was from Mumbai to South Africa via the Seychelles, Mombasa, and Maputo. It ended in Durban, and passengers were mainly Indian nationals looking to offer their trade expertise and look at new business opportunities.
What actually happened in 1942 on the 23rd of November?
What happened to SS Tilawa? So this is where the forgotten tragedy starts. On November 20th, 1942, the ship left Mumbai for South Africa. There were 222 crew members, 732 passengers, 9 lifeboats, over 6,000 tons of cargo, which included 60 tons of silver bullion. And a couple of days later, in the early hours of the morning on November 23rd, about 900 miles northeast of the Seychelles, there was an attack on the ship by the Japanese Imperial Army. It was the I-29 submarine. It twice torpedoed Tilawa, and after the first torpedo attack, the first officer transmitted SOS messages. But for the next 2 days, Keith, all aboard would be fighting for their lives, bitten by random shark attacks and seeing their fellow passengers and loved ones drowned to death. Eventually, a rescue mission led by a Royal Navy cruiser, HMS Birmingham and SS Carthage, ensured 682 people were rescued. So we lost 280 people, and those who were rescued were taken back to Mumbai on November 27th.
Well, the tragedy obviously shook everyone at the time, but as you say, since then it's been forgotten. We're going to take a short break. This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Lyca Radio. I'm talking to Emile Solanki, the innovator of a campaign campaign for us to remember Tilawa 1942, the forgotten tragedy. When we come back, we'll talk about how we can help with his campaign and one or two other points that I think will be of interest. Join us after the break.
Keithvaz on Talking Points, Lyca.
Welcome back. This is Keithvaz on Talking Points on Lyca Radio. I am talking to Emile Solanki about his campaign, the Tilawa 1942, the forgotten tragedy. It sounds like a heartbreaking story, what has happened. This is the first time I've heard of it, and I think many of the listeners on Lyca Radio would have heard about it for the first time. What are you planning to do as far as events are concerned in Canada and in the UK, and how can people help with this campaign?
Well, Keith, the reason why you have not heard much about it is because people had forgotten that it even existed. May I say that my great-grandfather was actually on that ship, Keith. He lost his life, and my family were waiting a month for him to return, and he did not. Thank goodness he left one child behind, a 9-year-old son, my grandfather. Otherwise, I wouldn't be alive here talking to you today. So, for many years it was a taboo subject, and back in 2007, leading up to my grandfather's death, he spoke of the ship. He spoke of his real father. He spoke of the fact that there were precious metals on Tilawa. We knew back then that there was silver bullion. And Keith, you won't believe it. A couple of years ago, a British exploration company actually found the wreck site. They saw the ship. They found over 2,300 silver bars. And so now we can further our research. So you ask, how can people help? What would we like to do? So, this year, 80th anniversary in November, we would like to get Tilawa back on the map. We would like support from the Indian and British government with research, access to archives, memorializing the event, getting Tilawa prominently featured in the Maritime Museum and similar. You'll be pleased to know, Keith, that Narendra Modi approved the first national maritime museum to be built in Gujarat, our home state.
Emile, has there been any attempt to contact the relatives of those who perished, or indeed the survivors of those who did not die in the attack?
So there was intent. Back in 2007, we know during the 65th anniversary of Tilawa that there were a couple of people alive in South Africa. It's my understanding that they have sadly passed away. However, their descendants are now in contact with us, see what more can be done in our research and trying to find more answers.
Let me ask you a final question about life in Toronto. You've been around, if I can put it in a very nice way. Your parents started off in Uganda. You've lived in London, you've lived in Leicester. You're now in Toronto in Canada. What's it like? How is the diaspora community doing, the Indian diaspora community doing in Canada?
It's great, Keith. I love it here. I mean, apart from the cold weather, it's always sunny. There's a lot more space. The cost of real estate is cheaper here compared to Europe. As far as the Indian community is concerned, the Punjabi Sikh community is more prominently featured in Canada. The Punjabi Sikh community started immigrating over 100 years ago to the western coast of Canada, whereas the Gujarati community, as you know, went to the Midlands back in the 50s and 60s, to Leicester and London, etc. So that really is where the diaspora sits. But yeah, it's a wonderful country. I do try to get back once a year to see the family.
Emile Solanki, you have taken on a very important and interesting campaign. I think we all want to know more about this particular event that happened, and thank you for spending the time and creating the interest in ensuring that all of us support you in what you are doing. The best of luck from all the listeners of Lyca Radio, and indeed from Lyca Radio itself. If there's anything that we can do to help, let us know. We'll be happy to help you.
Well, thank you, Keith, firstly, for your decades of faithful public service. Thank you to your kind invitation to have us on Lyca Radio, the first radio station to hear this story from us. And greetings from Toronto to all of your dear listeners.